So I'm talking to you from just outside Bogota in Colombia, and I'm half Colombian, half US white European heritage. So my mom's people came from Norfolk in like the 1600s, from England to what's now the US. And my dad was an immigrant from Colombia to the US when he was 17. And I'm living out here. I've been here since September. I've got my grandmother, uncles, cousins out here. But I was just 17 years in the UK, although I was born and raised in the US. And I was in the higher education sector, education for sustainable development, for many years. So I'm very oriented towards climate change and the collapse-driven narratives. And most recently, I founded an organization for refugees and asylum seekers in Lincolnshire in England. So I was doing that work to keep myself grounded in what was happening on the ground and not just in my head about climate change and what's happening. And then I volunteered with Extinction Rebellion as a trainer for their principles and values. And then I was communications coordinator for Deep Adaptation Forum, which is very collapse driven. So from those two experiences particularly, I'm now very much on the decolonization path. And I do mean decolonization in the real sense of the word, of giving land back. You know, not just let's decolonize our minds and do easy things. I do mean the harder work. So yeah, the past couple of years, I've really been learning so much. And now since December, I've been sharing it through workshops, creating kind of reflective spaces for people to be able to sit with the really deeply uncomfortable stuff around white supremacy culture, cult dynamics, how vulnerable we are to eco-fascism. Just getting people to kind of settle their nervous systems in this work so that we're better able to think. Because we have so much coming at us that it's difficult to make the time to think critically and decide what needs to be done. And for me, the framework is that because we haven't had a culture that's really good at taking care of one another and keeping our nervous systems regulated, particularly white culture, it means that when we hear things about climate change and collapse, our nervous system, you know, like we go into fight, flight, freeze kind of thing, and we're not thinking. And that makes us very vulnerable to like the government, to politicians, to environmental movements that are pushing solutions that actually would sacrifice people and ecosystems around the world. So for me, it's like, if we are able to do the work around anti-racism and decolonization, it will mean that we're better able to be humble and curious around what would be appropriate responses. And this means being able to connect with people who do not benefit from the system that we benefit from. Because we benefit so much from this system, we're not able to see it for what it is. And so if we're able to make friends with and listen to people who don't benefit from the system, we'll be able to see how best to resist the system and also how to survive without the system, so that we're not so anxious about losing it. And they have, you know, people in their networks of mutual aid have been able to figure out how to take care of one another and keep each other as safe as possible. And that's exactly what we need to be doing. And in order to do that, we need to do this work so that we can become humble around how they managed to do that and what we're missing out on, and what we lose in our humanity by being so tied into the system as it is.
Yeah, you're speaking my language. I mean, I'm just trying to think what I can actually ask you now, because I'm always trying to be aware that people watching might have no idea what we're talking about, right?
Sure.
Because I've also been down a lot of this training in decolonization. So, to somebody who, let's say, is just starting to wake up to the climate crisis, for example, I really like what you said about, the nervous system, right? Because it does come down to the body. It comes down to, like, if we're not regulated, yeah, we're gonna do something like raid a shop, or I don't know, like scream on social media, or what are we going to do? We're not going to be really thinking clearly, right? So for someone who doesn't really get it yet, how does decolonization connect with that piece about anxiety about what's failing?
Mhm. So if you're just kind of waking up to the climate crisis and you're like worried about collapse, I think the first thing is, yes, to be able to be with other people who are thinking the same, because it feels like such a sense of relief to be able to talk about it out loud with other people and not feel so isolated. The problem I've seen in the places that I've been in the past couple of years is that that space where people are able to talk about it is not being held. So it becomes just reinforcing the anxiety. Like they'll, like in a Facebook group, they'll post another article saying how bad things are, right? And so then your nervous system just. So what we need is for people to have a space to be able to talk about it, but then also a space where it's going to support your nervous system. And you will have like a tension between being in the comfort zone of being with people like yourself who are panicking and feeling the anxiety of what you're going to lose or what you might lose, from a place of privilege. So there's going to be that tension of that comfort with stretching yourself to educate yourself about why we need each other, and why we particularly need to be able to hear the stories of people who don't have as much privilege as we do. And we're not doing that to be nice, good, like, I don't want to be seen as a racist. Yes, let's do it for that reason as well. But also because it will help us figure out the most appropriate response to make. Because we can't see the system for what it is. We benefit too much. So we need to do this work so that we're better able to hear the voices of people who don't benefit from the system, because it's from them that we will learn how to survive without the system. So if you're worried about survival and what to do, you need to do the decolonization work.
And listen to people who have lived in harmony with the earth for thousands of years without needing the system that we have now. I've been noticing that as narratives about collapse get stronger and louder, there's another narrative happening about control, right? Like that the billionaires or the governments or whoever these people are trying to exert more and more control. And you mentioned before the danger of sliding into eco-fascism. So yeah, can you say more about that?
Yeah, so yeah. One of the workshops I run is on eco-fascism, and we look at examples of language that is very commonly used in politics and environmental movements that normalize dehumanizing people, that normalize kind of being glib and not needing to take responsibility for things, like saying, oh, we're all racist, or we're all eco-fascists, or, you know, and the dangers of that. Things like going for net zero carbon emissions, putting, first of all, it's a white supremacy culture pattern to like have numerical goals. Like we can see, for example, in the NHS in the UK, which is a national health service, they will say, oh, we want to bring patient wait times down, or, you know, like putting numerical measures is dangerous, because then it's like at any cost. Like, do you want to see 100 patients a day, or do you want each patient you see to have a quality experience? You know, which is the measurement? With zero carbon emissions, if we say, if we're coming at it from a very scared perspective about the future, and people are saying we need net zero, everyone's talking about zero, you'll be thinking, please, please get us to net zero as quickly as possible. If that's the solution, please get us there at any cost. And the at any cost is the indigenous people in Colombia being assassinated for trying to protect their land, their livelihoods from mining. Mining in other countries that are going to give us electric cars. And these are like false solutions, because they're not just harming other people, but we have very powerful people, as you say, who are rubbing their hands with making money off of what's happening in the world. And there are those of us that like to believe that people, you know, humans are, you know, like they're just doing they have the best intentions at heart. But there are people who have been very badly hurt as children, who've been trained to be the elite in the world. And they don't see things the way we do. And it's almost like it's a game for them to see what they can get away with and to make as much profit as they can. And so we need to get literate about the white supremacy culture patterns and about how vulnerable we are to eco-fascism, because we don't want to inadvertently be supporting policies that ultimately start sacrificing people, because that's a slippery slope. When we, you know, there's famous quotations about first they came for the ... And so if we start saying it's okay if they sacrifice those people, eventually it'll be closer to home. And even in England, we see with COVID, people are being sacrificed.
Yeah. And it's, you know, it makes me think of the Second World War, right? Because Britain went to Hitler, yeah, you can take Czechoslovakia, that's fine. No one will notice. This is where I'm living now, in former, what was Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. And then, you know, people act as if oh, I can't believe the Holocaust was allowed to happen. And yet now, what's happening to all the millions of refugees, right? What's happening to, yeah, from what was it, 2015, when everyone was really focused on the refugee crisis from Syria, and now we don't talk about it, but they're still there. And well, the US has had plenty of horrifying things in the last few years, and people are letting it happen. And that's the fear, right? That we are able to compartmentalize so deeply that, I can tell you there was a tornado in the Czech Republic a couple of weeks ago, in the Czech Republic, right? And it destroyed a couple of villages. And I still found in my brain, it was trying really hard to say, well, that was in the south of the Czech Republic, so you're okay, you know? And I'm just wondering to myself, how close does it have to be for my brain to, accept that there is a danger? Is it, oh, the next door neighbor, oh, that's okay, I'm in this apartment. And yeah, so I would like to hear more about white supremacy culture patterns. If you could tell us kind of, yeah, some examples maybe, and
Mhm.
what that means really.
Sure. So the 18 patterns come from Tima Okun. So she's got this famous paper that she wrote in the 90s and had 15 patterns. And she just in May updated it and added 3 more. And one of them that she added is fear. And of course, now it just makes total sense, but it should have been there all along, because we're very driven by fear. We're afraid of losing our jobs, of health, losing healthcare in some countries. Well, now there's fear of COVID. There's also the more basic, like fear of not belonging, fear of being ostracized, fear of getting things wrong. So there's a pattern of perfectionism, and all of this affects our nervous system to be living in fear all the time. Whereas there'll be other cultures that aren't so driven by fear, that are more present in the day to day. And so that nervous system dysregulation means that we're not thinking clearly, like you say. And so we're constantly maybe in a state of outrage or numbness or panic. And so we do not want to be making decisions under this kind of influence. Other patterns include binary thinking. So this whole us versus them. I'll use Brexit as an example. Leave versus remain. I mean, the referendum itself is a very false binary to how do you vote for one or the other? It's so complex. And life and humans are complex. And so when we fall into this binary thinking of like our electric cars, good or bad, if Trump is bad, then Biden must be good. And so we can't criticize Biden because that would mean that Trump's good. There's this very scary binary thinking that happens with people. Vaccinations, like it's yes or no, it's masks or not, instead of being able to think, things are really complex, and to be able to sit with the discomfort of how complex things are, and that we need to talk about things, think things through, look at alternatives. And when we have binary thinking, there's no space for alternatives and for the nuance. And so this plays out in climate change, collapse, in politics. And so like white supremacy culture patterns, once you become literate in them, you see them everywhere. And they play into cult dynamics as well. Something doesn't need to be a cult to have cult dynamics, but the cult dynamics can come through where we're not allowed to question things. So if you've said, oh, I'm leave or I'm remain, you're not allowed to say, but I do kind of see what they mean on the other side. And that is a worry. you're not allowed to do that. People want you to, be firm on one side or the other. And this can come up with climate change, like being a climate change denier can mean that you can't, that's it. Like you'll lose your sense of identity and your value. You'll lose your friends if you start saying, well, actually, these extreme temperatures in the US are scaring me. And I'm supposed to be a climate change denier. So those are some of the patterns.
Yeah, and what strikes me is that binary thinking is what happens when you're in that fight or flight mode, right? When you're kind of living from the reptilian brain, and so it does come back, like you said, to the nervous system. So is it fair to say maybe the system we're in deliberately keeps us in a state of anxiety all the time so that those cult dynamics can be played out?
Yeah, thanks for saying that. So when Tima Okun added the fear pattern, the one side was that we're always afraid of losing, like the economy, capitalism makes it so that we're always worried. The other side is that the fear is used to manipulate us. So the media, the people in power, they know we're in this state and that we have these patterns. Sensationalism that we see in the newspapers and the headlines. I recently was watching RT News, which comes out of Russia, and I was shocked at like how sensationalistic it was, and that the music and the way it's edited and everything, my whole body just goes into like, panic mode, the fear response. And the idea is to make things look chaotic so that authoritarians make sense. Authoritarians can come in and say, we're going to take care of this and keep you safe. You don't need to think. You don't need to question what we're doing. You just go about being distracted by things that you enjoy. You dip into the news, get scared and outraged. Remember, you've got the authoritarians in charge, and go back to the distraction. Yes, so it's definitely used to manipulate us.
Yeah, yeah. And I really liked what you said earlier as well about, if we can look at ways of living that are not dependent on the system, then we won't be so afraid of losing the system, right? It's almost like an abusive partner, I feel, who makes you think you need me.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be that I'd want people to drop out of the system. The idea is to resist the system and to change it. So yeah, being able to kind of start to see the alternative ways. How do people who live in this system survive without the system when the system doesn't benefit them? So it's like creating infrastructure that supports us while we still have this system, while we're figuring out how to replace it. And in order to do that, we need, people who know how to do it. And we need our nervous systems to be very well regulated so that we can really think about it and make good choices and have good relationships with one another, because obviously we have a lot of poor relationships in our culture because people are always acting out of fear and wanting to fit in, and then getting upset with one another when expectations aren't met. And it just creates a very messy environment from which we're operating. And we need to figure this out so that we can think and get close to each other, because we really need each other right now through everything that's happening now. This isn't even the future anymore. For those of us with privilege, we can see it now. And there are other people who survived collapse hundreds of years ago and who are going through collapse in a much harder way than we are right now. But even we can see what's happening. And we need to figure out how to have each other completely and support each other in what's happening.
Yeah, at the exact time when it's been deemed illegal to meet each other for the last year or so, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know about you. I felt that despite that, the level of global connection I felt has been greater this year, this last 2 years than ever before, because I connected online with people that normally wouldn't have happened.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, can you give me a tiny example of what might happen in one of your workshops? What kind of people show up?
Yeah, so it tends to be people who are driven by the collapse narrative. So they're people who, have been in Extinction Rebellion or have, been spending a lot of time with the idea of collapse. And what I try to do in the workshops is give very little input. Like perhaps for the white supremacy culture patterns, I just tell you what the patterns are. And then a lot of time for people to just, okay, yes, I see this everywhere. I see this in myself. I see this in my workplace. I see this in movements, organizations, in my family. It's because we just don't have that space. Like if I was to email you the list of patterns, you might read them and go, yeah. And then you get a phone call or, whatever. So this is like a 2-hour space to engage with other people and try and reinforce, like what you're actually reading and try to connect it up. And one of the new things I'm about to launch is a Facebook group that will be for people who have done some of the main workshops like white supremacy culture patterns, cult dynamics, and eco-fascism, to have a place to continue to engage with it so that everyone's kind of on the same page. And then people can go in and say, oh, guess what happened at work? It's this pattern that's completely, playing out. And now I see it and I never used to see it before. And so a place to kind of reinforce the learning and push it forward and make connections and start to figure out what do we need to do next to figure out how the system works and doesn't work, and moving towards that space where we can engage with people who don't benefit from the system. So people with disabilities, Black, Indigenous people of color, people from the global South.
Great. And do you have a vision for the future that keeps you going with this work?
Absolutely. One of the workshops I do is on hope and privilege and the word hope and how it's used, because there's a lot of, privilege use of the word hope. For me, I find it really hopeful that people want to do this work because it means we're more likely to figure out how to take care of one another and keep each other as safe as possible. So my vision is that we just keep moving towards that, and that middle-class white Western people get to the point where we're using our power and privilege to back the leadership of people who don't benefit from the system so that we can resist it, so we're better able to resist it and replace it. So my hope is around that. I think we are moving in that direction, no matter what happens this year, next year, tomorrow. All these things are happening and they're so challenging, but it's figuring out new skills, new ways to be with one another, figuring out how to be in our bodies as things happen, I find that super hopeful, and that's kind of where I want to see the future.
Great. So, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Just that I think it's great what I've heard about you, talking to you, that I love how you're wanting to hear from people that you normally, that you normally wouldn't hear from, and that we don't hear from enough. And I think that's what we want to do. We want to like just change those little, start to tweak our thinking and broaden what information we're putting in front of us, because that's what I do. Like with my Twitter feed, for example, it's full of people that are on the ground doing this mutual aid work, anarchists, abolitionists, and that's what really gets my brain, like new neurons, making new connections and figuring out places where I've not, I've had blind spots that I didn't realize. So that's how I'd want to end it, is saying, yeah, fantastic that you're doing this work, and that we are starting to grow a network of people doing this work together. Thank you.
Thank you.